think one of the words in our world that seems to have really become a very common word is the word culture. I just want to talk about that a little bit. I know many of you will have talked about it and taught on it. As to me, an intriguing shift in our world is the whole subject of culture. Of course, culture is not new, but we used to talk about it from a kind of an ethnic point of view or a geographical point of view. It's only really the last 50 years, I guess, or thereabouts, maybe not even that, where we've talked about culture in the context of an organizational culture. And I think some of that is because it's only in the last 50 years that we've seen organizations birthed so rapidly. Prior to that, for an organization to happen, it took, decades to get to the point of even being a successful national organization, let alone a multinational or international organization. So this word culture, I would suggest, and one of the things that I fairly consistently say is that if doctrine and denominations go together, and I'm really not criticizing denominations. I'm good with them. It's denominationalism I have a problem with, where we divide. But I would suggest that doctrines or doctrinal statement goes with denominations. I would suggest that culture is to the apostolic what a doctrinal statement is to denominations. In other words, there is something of a defining nature, that it brings a definition. In other words, the reason why I say that is this: if I bring a doctrinal statement to this room, if I was a clever theologian, I could probably divide the room. Actually, if I'm not a clever theologian, I could probably divide the room. But I can take a point of theology and divide the room. Now, an example of that I use from my life is this: I'm not saying I shouldn't study it, but I tend not to study eschatology. And a lot of my reason for not studying eschatology is if I study something, I'll talk about it. And if I talk about eschatology, I will probably bring division. And I have positioned my life for a united bride. So to me, I know there might be a debate even around that, but for me, it doesn't help me to study that doctrine particularly. If you study it, I'm really good with that, and I know at least one person who's written a book on it in here. So I'm not criticizing it. It's just for me, it doesn't help where I'm at. So a doctrine can divide the room. We've seen that. That's why we've got denominationalism. We see divisions that happen, etc., etc. So I could divide the room. Whereas I would suggest that when I start talking about a culture, I can actually unite a room. So I can. And let's say, for instance, that Ben there is sitting right in the middle of the room, and let's say he represents Jesus. He's pretty good. He's pretty close. So he represents Jesus. Let's say we have a culture in this room of the goodness of God. He is 100%, no question about it. He knows that the Father is good all the time. He's come from the Father. He's got no doubts, no questions. The rest of us, we have a culture of the goodness of God. We are at different places around the room. We might even be over there declaring it, but we're not even quite sure that we believe it, but we're at least declaring it. Because the culture didn't say you have to 100% believe this all the time. And so for me, culture, let me give you a couple of thoughts specifically on culture. Firstly, culture is the way we do things around here, is one definition. Or culture is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Or culture is the thoughts, beliefs, the practices by which a people group cope with their world. So we have things that we do in this country that are different to another country because we're a people group that lives here. So why is culture powerful? Where's its power come from? The closest I can get to any sort of definition from the Bible, because culture in a way, it's a little bit like destiny. It's not really a biblical word, but it's crept into our world. Not crept, it's like landed in our world. The closest I can get is where Peter says, and the reference will be in your notes, Peter says, we have become partakers of the divine nature. So we're not just made in the image of God, we become partakers of the divine nature. I would suggest that divine nature is culture. And I'm going to unpack culture in a moment. So culture, I believe, creates an environment in which we can all participate. And so we can go, God's good. We might be, I think he's 75. Right now, I think he's about 5, he's about 10. My experience, but we're all in the room. Whereas if I make a line, a doctrinal statement, and says, if you want to be in this room, you have to be able to say 100% certain right this moment in time that you agree with the doctrine of the goodness of God. Some of you might be going, well, I got a few questions around this. I haven't quite worked it all out yet. So culture is a key, I believe, to an apostolic move of God. It's about bringing heaven's culture, the divine nature, from heaven to earth, which is a lot of what the apostolic was about with the Romans and the Greeks. They took the culture of Rome. Rome was full. They need somewhere else for Romans to live, so they come and make Britain like Rome. So they brought the culture. We are doing a similar thing. In other words, we are bringing the culture of heaven to earth. So let me just unpack it a little bit. Firstly, culture creates a place where things grow. And when you studied science in school, you were given a petri dish and they put something in it called a culture, agar. They put a culture in it. And stuff grew in it, didn't it? Yeah. Some of you remember school. The ones of you remember school. We grew stuff in it. It's actually interesting because, it grows good stuff, but also sometimes it grows weeds, which actually gave birth to one of the great scientific experiments or medical discoveries of all time, which is penicillin, because in the same dish, good and bad grew, and there was a reaction between the two. So culture enables things to grow. If you want things to grow in your organization, you need to create the right culture. Culture enables things to grow. I've already given the example, but Jesus created a culture which grew 11 world changers and 1 Judas. We need to not be so concerned about getting rid of these weeds as we are about creating an environment that grows the good stuff. So creating an environment where things grow. Culture enables things to grow, like the petri dish. It's a little bit like the story of the sower and the seed. We've got some of that soil where stuff grew. We want that. We want to create that. So there are cultures that enable things to grow. One of the best ones is the goodness of God. And if you want to change your church with one action, you can change your church with one action. Start every meeting with stories of the goodness of God. Tell stories about what he's done. Actually, you can change your business with stories of good stuff. It doesn't have to be the goodness of God if it's not Christian, basically a Christian business. Just talk about the right things that are happening. It works. It's a principle. So you start every meeting with a story of the goodness of God, of testimonies of what God is doing, not what he isn't doing. You will change the atmosphere, you will change the culture, and you will create a culture where people believe that stuff's going to happen. It's been one of the interesting things for Sue and I, that we spent 15 years surrounded by, constantly, all the time, stories of good news, of testimonies. And it's not quite the same for us. We're not in that environment in quite the same way. So we're aware that we need to bring that environment. We need to be reminding ourselves of those stories. So first and foremost, it enables things to grow. And even when we start making declarations, we're changing the culture. We're creating a culture, an expectation, the thoughts, beliefs, the practices. So growth, number one. Secondly, it protects. And if you go to Spain or somewhere like that, there's something wonderful that happens between about 12 o'clock lunchtime and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's called the siesta. And you have a nap for 2 hours. And we should just create an excuse to have a nap, really, shouldn't we? I mean, it should be like, we have a siesta. We don't have the sun, but we're going to have a siesta. But why do they have one? They have one because they want to protect the residents of Spain from the harsh effects of the noonday sun. And of course, it's where the little poem, the little criticism about us, mad dogs and Englishmen stay out in the noonday sun. Why? Because we don't understand the effect of the noonday sun. So they have a culture there, a siesta culture, to protect the residents from the harsh effects of the noonday sun. And I would suggest that heaven's culture, protects us from the harsh effects of life on earth. And that's important. Life on earth blames God for stuff he doesn't do. When I was diagnosed with cancer, it's very tempting to have God sent cancer to teach you a lesson thing going on. He didn't. He sent Jesus to teach cancer a lesson. That's what he did. But here's the problem. God's so good at turning bad stuff into something beautiful that you can easily think he sent the bad stuff because he's so good at making it beautiful. So we end up with a false theology. No, he's good. He doesn't do that. What an abusive dad to send cancer to teach you a lesson. That doesn't work in our view of a good God. So we have the protection. So when you're creating the culture, sometimes you're looking at protecting your people from the harsh effects of life on earth. Other times, like, what culture can we bring that helps people to grow? And a culture of risk and faith will grow your people in faith. If you create an environment where it's celebrated to risk and even fail, you will create a culture of faith. There's no question about it. And of course, one of the cultures that's really talked about a lot from Bethel and a lot because of Danny, but to be honest, we've all taught it, is a culture of honor. A culture of honor actually covers both of these areas. And it particularly creates an environment where we all grow because we're learning from each other. Because when I honor you, I learn from you. When I honor you, I see the things you're doing and I want to aspire to do the same things. But also a culture of honor protects us from the horrible stuff like, well, we're nothing. We're worthless sinners. No, we're not. Culture of honor says we're saints. He died because we're worth it, not because we're worth less. So culture creates an environment in which things grow. You want your people to grow in love and honor and faith and being empowered and many other cultures that we could list. So environment where things grow, an environment that protects us from the harsh effects of life on earth. And then, and probably one of my favorites is that it's the way we see. Now, I've already touched on this a little bit. That's supposed to be a camera. It's a reasonable lens. The camera's in doubt. But what happens is, if you take a lens, if you look through it one way, it gives you one view of the world. You turn it around, it gives you another view. And I love telephoto lenses. And what you do is you're moving the elements of that lens backwards and forwards to bring a subject into focus. Now, depending on which element you put in front, depends on how you see. When we were coming back to move back to Europe, somebody at one point said to my wife, why would you move back to Europe where the enemy's big and the fruit's small? They really did say that to her. And she said, well, that's not the Europe we're going back to. We've seen the big fruit and the small enemy. It's the Joshua Caleb in the promised land. They saw something different than the other spies. So culture actually trains me to see, my friend Leif Hetland's phrase, through heaven's eyes. It trains me to see that way. So when we were early days at Bethel, we had a conversation with Bill and Chris about healing and process. It's a very profound conversation. Conversation went like this. Do you want a culture of process, he said to us, that embraces healing, or do you want a culture of healing that embraces process? Now, it's a very interesting one, because I guarantee you this, if you have a culture of process with an occasional healing, eventually you'll have no healings. If you have a culture of healing that embraces process, you'll have both. And actually you'll see the miracle in the process. But if you only go, well, we're process first, and if there's an occasional healing, we'll celebrate it, you'll probably eventually end up with no miracles of healing. So it helps us trains us. How do you see? The whole stuff about what time is it? How do you see the world? Are you afraid of the population increase, or do you see it as an opportunity? Do you see the change as a threat, or do you see it as an opportunity? Do you see the technological advances as scary and a threat, or do you see them as an incredible opportunity? How do you see? So culture helps us to get our lenses in the right order, so to speak, so that we are learning to see with heaven's eyes. And it's hard not to quote it, but having walked into the room where two of our closest kids have a full-term stillbirth, and to see them saying, "God, you're good," and worshiping him is one of the most extraordinary moments of my life, for certain, to see their faith, that they could see that way. And they refuse to be offended by God. But if you don't have your lenses in the right order, you'll be offended, and you'll actually cut yourself off from the only answer in your circumstances. Because if we reject that he's good in the midst of something we don't understand, we will actually cut ourselves off from the only voice that can speak to us in our pain. So it helps us, it trains us to see. So we have a culture, creates an environment of growth. It protects us from the harsh effects of life on earth. It trains us to see with heaven's eyes. And then it's the yeast, it's the leaven in the dough. It affects everything. It affects every part of life. And it doesn't matter where in this organization or your organization you look. You should be able to see the cultures that you're creating. I've recently picked up this book by Horst Schultz, who runs Ritz-Carlton hotels, and he had this basic mantra, and the mantra was this: we recruit ladies and gentlemen who serve ladies and gentlemen. I like that. That means that the bellboy, or the door guy, whatever their name is, I've lost the name, they are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. That changes everything. That means that everyone in the organization has got that culture. I love that at Bethel you're just as likely to get a prophetic word off one of the cleaners as you are off one of the leaders. Because it's gone through the whole culture. We're a revival culture. We're living to bring heaven to earth. That's what we do. So you should be able to find it in every part of the organization. If you want a culture of honor, and you don't honor every person who works in your church, every person who comes through the doors, you don't have a culture of honor. A culture of honor will affect everything and everyone. So all of these, and I usually draw a loaf of bread there, but you already laughed at my camera, so I'm not going to risk the loaf of bread. But what we have is really what we need for an apostolic move of God. An apostolic move of God is about the culture. The truth is, we wouldn't have a Bible if they hadn't told the stories about themselves to the next generation. So telling stories, culture is conveyed through education. We learn best through repetition, and we learn really well through stories. And one of my favorite kind of cultural stories would be that the Europeans went over to America. They found America, and they were used to harvest festivals. So we'd have our harvest festivals in Europe. They went over to America, and then they worked their way through the summer, and they get to the end of the summer and they find some corn, turkey and yam, and they have a celebration and they give thanks. They took it though to another level. They took it to the level that they did that every year. They got it to the point that it was actually enshrined in the law of the land, that the fourth Thursday in November is a national holiday called Thanksgiving. That's an incredibly good example of a culture of thanksgiving. They took something and they kept on doing it, and they keep telling the story to the next generation. And actually Americans are almost more likely to fly home for Thanksgiving than they are to fly home for Christmas, which is fascinating to me. And I would suggest, I doubt that any president would risk doing this, but you could take it away from the law, and I suspect that Americans would still fly home, and they would take their own day off and they would celebrate Thanksgiving. It is so much a part of their way they do things. And if you think about it, that's this, because there is something in them that is we give thanks. And we know that being thankful is powerful in our lives. That it does protect them from the harsh effects, as it were, of everyday life. Because there's a day set aside where they gather as family and they give thanks. And it changes the way they see. Maybe just for one day, probably a little bit longer than that. But they see the world through thankful eyes. And it's definitely affected everything and everyone who lives in that land. So I would just encourage you, as we go through the school, that you just are conscious of anything that is about culture. And I would suggest don't have too many cultures that you're going after at any particular time. I've been to some churches and they've given me a list of 24 cultures. And I'm like, that's not going to work too well for your people. You spend 40 hours a week working in church. Your people spend an hour and a half. Give them something that is that they can experience. Maybe 3, maybe 5 cultures. And often I find that cultures are related to seasons. You can find particular cultures that you need if you're birthing something. If you're starting a new ministry, there are cultures that are really good for getting something started. Or maybe you're we need a new vision season. You probably need cultures of prophecy and of revelation and of hope because you're in a vision season. Or if you're in a season where you're like, we need to grow, you probably need to start thinking about some cultures around, particularly around risk and faith. Those are great cultures to help an organization to grow. So often cultures, you can focus on a culture for a particular season. And there's no question in my mind, one of the key moments in our 15 years in Bethel was, and I don't often call it this, but I think this is what it was, a culture of mystery was embraced in Bethel. And I'd never seen it before. I honestly could say I'd never seen it. But the day that Bill's father died, Bill kind of gave us permission to embrace a culture of mystery. We don't need to know all the answers. And from that, we saw great growth and great increase. So there was a moment of loss and of tragedy, and there was a culture that was released in that moment that actually changed everybody who was in the room that day and heard his message. So just stopping and thinking, where are we? What do we need right now? And cultures are the result of beliefs. Now, and core values. A lot of people talk about core values. I like core values. I don't really like one word core values very much, to be honest, because one word core values are open for interpretation. But I do like core values that are attached to behavior. So even a one-word core value, if it's attached to behavior, the behavior describes a little bit more and helps me. So a core value must always be evidenced by lived-out behavior, and that's what creates the culture. So you can put on your wall, we have a culture of risk, but if no one's taking risks, you don't have a culture of risks. You just have a word on a wall. And that's why it's really important you don't have too many in any particular season. And what you really want is for people to experience them. Because again, they can't just be words that say, oh, X church has a culture of the goodness of God, generosity, and loving the presence of God. If you don't, it won't be a culture. A culture is something that people experience. It's the way we do things around here. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And one thing I want to say is don't be afraid of making declarations about culture, even if you're not quite there. Because the declaration and the lived out behavior is a statement of excellence. And excellence doesn't mean you've got there. It means your heart has positioned you to get there. And there's so I want to encourage you, because you might be thinking, well, we can't say we've got a culture of honor because we're not quite there. If you're on the journey, if you're pursuing it, if you're going after it, then making declarations is the only way you'll get there. Now, some people who have that perfection mindset are like, we can't say that, we're not there. Like, we have a phrase at Bethel. Bethel's a cancer-free zone. It isn't. People die of cancer there. But we have made a declaration, which is a declaration of excellence, because we have positioned our hearts to pursue something that we haven't yet seen. So don't be afraid of making cultural declarations that we are We have a culture of generosity. We have a culture of honor. We have a culture of risk, a culture of faith, a culture of family. As long as you're on the journey, as long as it's not just a word on a wall. So don't be afraid of that. And culture is powerful. It's Peter Drucker, the business consultant from America, who said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. In other words, you can have the best strategy written down, but if you don't have the culture that supports it, your strategy will fail. And cultural change starts in the mind. It starts in the mind. It starts in beliefs. And we have the mind of Christ. So we should be the experts. We should be the experts in creating culture because we have the mind of Christ. So it starts with belief. It starts with you believing. It starts with you grabbing hold of a belief. And once again, isn't that who we are? Aren't we believers? Aren't we members of the Christian faith? So we start with believing something. We start with taking a value and believing it. And then we live it out. So if you believe in the goodness of God, if you believe He is good, start telling stories. Live it out. And watch a culture develop around you.